Good evening and welcome to our program featuring a very familiar and special face in North Attleborough, Doug Reed. On April 20th, 1987, the first edition of the Free Press was published, and since that date, the town has come to rely on its community newspaper. The newspaper's creator, editor, publisher retired in July of 2005, but before he left North Attleborough, he sat down with us to talk about his newspaper career, the Free Press, and the community in which he was so involved. We learned that newspaper ink seemed to flow through Doug Reed at a very early age.
Actually, the first time I had any interest at all was in the Boy Scouts. And my Boy Scout troop elected me scribe, which is report on the meetings. And so I said, sure, I'll take care of that. And I took a few notes, and the next morning, handwritten, I'd take them down to the local newspaper where I'd eventually work and give the report to one of the editors, and a couple days later I'd see it in the paper and it had my name on the bottom, Doug Reed, scribe. I said, God, this is pretty nice.
Doug continued his early writing interest by serving as sports editor of his high school newspaper and also volunteering at the St. Albans, Vermont newspaper, the Daily Messenger. During Doug's high school years, he spent more and more time at the Messenger, working on the sports page, which featured information from 6 different high schools, and doing whatever was needed to help. It wasn't long before editor Paul Rickson asked Doug to do some sports reporting and to take on more responsibility.
I was hired as sports editor of the newspaper, the Daily Messenger, the day I graduated from high school. Had a bad cold, and my first job was an interview with Jack Dempsey, who was up there opening supermarkets for IGA. I don't know if there are any IGAs left anymore.
I don't know, in Western Mass there might be.
Yeah.
How did you prepare to interview Jack Dempsey? Did you do a lot of prep work, or how did you do
that?
A
little bit, yeah. I did some research, over at the library. Not like today, you can get on the internet and have scads of questions. But of course, I had heard of Jack Dempsey in his back in the 30s when he was champion, and kept all this information. But he did a lot of talking, loves to talk, or loved to talk at that time, and so it wasn't a difficult interview, except that he did have 2 of his, I can't call them bodyguards, but associates with him. We had lunch, and I had a bad cold, had tears running down my eyes, but we got it out.
You got it got through and got it edited. Have you always wanted to be an editor? When you started writing, did you look at the paper as a whole and think, gee, I'd like to what got you started thinking you wanted to run your own newspaper?
Probably not until I came to, I did work part-time as an editor for the Messenger. Matter of fact, filled in several times for Rickson when they were moving to another plant, and he was working late hours, and I'd come in the morning and get started and do the editing. At the same time, the city editor we had was blind, so I had to do a little bit of editing for him. When he did a lot of good typing, had good ideas, but obviously couldn't do a lot of actual hands-on editing. So that's when I probably got started, and I wasn't, enthusiastic. Gee, I want to be an editor. It just came to be.
It happened. Doug served in the Marine Corps from 1961 through 1963, where he was able to continue his writing and utilize his newspaper background.
Essentially, it was I was in Paris Island, and somebody started reading my background, and they needed someone at the base informational services. These little items that Lance Corporal Johnson or Billy Burke has just finished basic training, and do this stuff and get it into the mail to the hometown newspapers. And I did that for probably 6 months, a year, and then they needed a sports editor. So on the base newspaper, so I did that, and then they had an opening in Okinawa, 3rd Marine Division, and so I said, sure, I'll go over there. That was good. And as I'm over there, I eventually became editor of the 3rd Marine Division newspaper, and met a lot of people. And when it was coming time to leave, I had spent a little over a year there. They said, you know, we'll give you another promotion if you'll join these other people over in this place, South Vietnam. And I said, nah, I'll pass. And if I hadn't, you know, I got back, landed in San Francisco the day that President Kennedy got killed.
Oh my goodness, yeah.
And at that time we figured we're frozen, we're going to war somewhere, and that was the immediate thought of the troops who were coming back.
Yeah.
But it didn't happen, and I did still have the choice. I could leave then or stay on until January of the next year, which was 3 months. If I had taken the latter offer, then I would have been frozen because LBJ froze all the enlistments and started escalating the war.
Interesting how life works out.
Isn't
A choice made one day.
Yeah, yeah. While I was still in the Marine Corps, I was sending out letters, and I had several responses, one of them being the Boston Globe.
Oh, neat.
And but I went into the office, and Tom Winship was there, and he was going to interview me. And as I sat there and I looked over, I saw, you know, 24, 30 desks, all with white shirts and ties
Really?
and typewriters.
Yes.
And I said, this isn't for me. And I didn't even go into the interview. I left and hit the train because I had other appointments. And I stopped in Attleborough at the time because I knew Paul was down here.
Paul Rickson had left Vermont and the St. Albans Daily Messenger to work on some political campaigns and had settled in the Attleborough area. He was the managing editor of the Attleborough Sun when Doug came to visit him. So Doug finished up his round of interviews, got on the train, and headed back to Keene, New Hampshire, where he was a reporter for the Keene Evening Sentinel. Meanwhile, down in Attleborough, Paul Rickson was remembering Doug and all the good work he had done up in Vermont.
And it was probably, 2 years later that he called me while I was in Keene and need somebody down here. Can you help me out?
And you did.
Yeah, that's how I got to Attleborough, which was 1965.
Doug remained with the Attleborough Sun for the next 4 years, serving as a reporter, photographer, and even sports editor. In 1969, he returned to New Hampshire and worked at Blue Cross Blue Shield in Concord, where he was still able to utilize his writing and editorial skills. He was responsible for 10 publications each month. But Doug was destined to come back to the Attleboroughs. In 1970, he received a phone call that would change his life. 2 newspapers, the Attleborough Sun and North Attleborough's Evening Chronicle, were merging.
As I say, the first call that I got was while I was in Concord, New Hampshire, from Clarence Roberts, who was the editor at the time of the Attleborough Sun. And he said that the papers, the Chronicle and the Sun, were going to merge. And would I be interested in coming back as managing editor? And after he laid everything out, I hadn't thought about coming back, but I couldn't say no.
Rusty Darconti, who was now the publisher for the Sun Chronicle, remembers Doug's enthusiasm and his competitive spirit when they worked and played together.
Back in the old days, there were enough media people in the Attleborough area that you could have a softball game where the Sun Chronicle would play against people from the Pawtucket Times and the Province Journal and WARA. They could field their own teams, and we'd play charity games and play a lot of softball. It was a lot of fun. I can remember one time somebody from the ARA painted a grapefruit block and pitched it in as a thing, and the person hit it and it exploded, of course, all over the infield. That was quite a big joke. Doug was very aggressive, very always liked to win. I think that was probably a lot of his Marine background. He was always very proud of being a Marine, and he always played to win, and he always made for good games. Always made for good games.
Doug stayed at the Sun Chronicle until 1983, and then he went on to become copy editor at the Patriot Ledger in Quincy and the executive editor of the Pawtucket Evening Times, all until his dream to start his own newspaper began to take shape.
It was 1986 when I was executive editor for the Evening Times in Pawtucket that the idea came to me to start a weekly newspaper. It was time for something. I mean, you're not getting any younger, and that was one of my goals in the earlier years. So I checked with a broker, and he suggested the two locations that are best in Bristol County right now are North Attleborough and North Dartmouth. North Attleborough is, you know, a no-brainer. Loved the people here, knew many of them, and so started studying and making plans. And we ended up, fortunately, at this location, which is 34 North Washington Street, and right behind us, of course, was the old Evening Chronicle building. At that time, the lawyers were taking it over and making a nice remodeling job out of it. But it seemed perfect for us. Newspaper Row was also right around the corner where we had offices, the Chronicle, the Sun, the Evening Times, and the Providence Journal. So when this became available, and at that time, then it was, again, an easy decision to make. We had contacted Mr. Parizeau, and he made this available, and I signed a lease at that time for a year, and we figured we'd go from there.
Doug and co-publisher Bill Henschel offered the local cable channel the opportunity to visit them soon after they published the first edition of the paper in 1987. They showed us the nuts and bolts of putting the newspaper together and how each page needed to be set up in photo-ready form.
The red rectangles you're seeing are spaces where pictures will appear in the finished product. Now there are two typesetters in the office. One is for regular news story print, and the other is used for headings and for advertising. After the information is typed, it comes out in cartridge form, and this cartridge is developed in a special processor. And then the type is finished and hung on the clothesline to dry. If the staff is in a real rush, Bill told us about the handy-dandy dryer, which will dry the print in a jiffy.
Now, in order to make this type adhere or stick to the pages as we're pasting them up, we have to have something on the back. So we use this melted wax, and this keeps the wax at a certain temperature, so that when we process the type through, it comes out with wax on the back of it. And now, of course, it'll stick. The reception from the people has just been incredible. People have been coming into the office. They've been explaining how much they appreciate having their own newspaper in North Attleborough again. It is just hard to describe the fun we've been getting out of the people coming in and visiting with us.
Well, we became interested in newspapers, as Bill said, many years ago. Both Bill and I have newspaper backgrounds. We probably selected North Attleborough more importantly because it's a growing community, and it seems to be a community that really has a pattern to where it's going. We've been compared quite favorably by some of the older residents of the community to the Chronicle. They miss the Chronicle. We hope to fill that void. We do have a very limited staff, obviously, working with a weekly newspaper. Our overhead is not that much. We've been fortunate to find an office downtown at 34 North Washington Street, right on the corner of Church Street, to lease. We have a lease here for a couple of years, and we hope to be around a heck of a lot longer than that. Our staff right now numbers probably a little over 4.5 to 5, counting a few part-timers, 4 full-timers, Bill Henschel and myself, obviously. Bill handling most of the advertising, myself handling most of the news. And we have Hope Clark, who is our office manager, and she kids about that because she has a staff of no one to work with, but she's doing a heck of a job at it anyway. She's formerly from Attleborough City Hall. As a matter of fact, she was executive secretary for the past 2 mayors. And Elizabeth Peterson, she's also from New Hampshire, has been our advertising sales rep. She's doing a good job with that also. We also have a few part-timers, photographer Richard Empey, and a young lady by the name of Jennifer Reed has been helping out in the newsroom.
Of course, you know, I still take credit to this day for naming the newspaper because, you know, and that was mainly because I was spending a lot of time going up to Vermont visiting my grandfather. And I can remember just one Saturday afternoon, we were all sitting in the living room talking about, well, okay, you know, we've got the plan in place. What are we going to call this thing? You know, and a bunch of names were thrown out, and we're kind of humming and hawing. And the Burlington Free Press is up in Vermont, and I knew that newspaper, so I said, how about the Free Press? You know, and everybody said, yeah, how about that? You know, so that was the only reason. It wasn't this you know, great, you know, illumination or anything that that came to us.
I never realized that you came up with the name. I guess I never thought about it.
You know, but what I can say is, you know, I put it on the table and they just didn't say no.
From the beginning, the focus of the newspaper was community.
Anyone who has an article or an idea for an article or a photograph for that matter, will entertain either doing the story or publishing the story. We have community news. We're here for and about North Attleborough residents, and so far seems to be going over very well.
Over the years, we certainly entertained a lot of staffers, workforce part-time, full-time, taking photographs. Dick Empey, my daughter Jennifer, who still contributes a weekly column, she's currently Director of Communications at Dean College. And of course, with her 2 sons at home, still finds time to help out. But we had other people selling advertising. Betty Poirier, matter of fact, worked for a while, and Joanne Cathcart, who's now over the police station, and there's so many that really, you know, if I tried to list everyone, probably take out the rest of this segment here.
He was concerned about being accepted in North Attleborough. As most people know who have lived in either one community or the other all their life, they know that there's this inbred kind of rivalry between the 2 communities. But Doug is, by nature, I think, a very low-profile kind of guy. He doesn't make a lot of noise and a lot of show, but he shows up. He observes everything that's going on very keenly and reacts to it. And I think over the length of time that he was here, he became an integral part of North Attleborough. He certainly was astute enough to realize who did what and how they did it and who was involved and who was committed to the community. He became part of that mechanism. He became part of several boards and commissions in town. He helped people whenever the opportunity was presented to him, and he really became an accepted part of the North Attleborough community.
Tried to emphasize that we weren't there to compete with the Sun Chronicle or the Providence Journal or the Boston Globe. We were there as a community newspaper. Hopefully that would be accepted that way. Of course, over the years, many people did compare us to the Sun Chronicle and say, well, you know, it's you've got this story, and they didn't have this story. But, you know, they're 7 days a week, we're 1 day a week. And we tried to cover news from the beginning as much as we could and as well as we could.
No newspaper likes to see another product start up in your market, and over the years we've seen dozens of them, you know, come and go, and it was hard to tell how successful that was going to be. You know, Doug had, to my knowledge, and at least to my memory, didn't have any very strong North Attleborough ties prior to that, but I think he selected a community and he saw there was a market. There were, if you go back historically, I mentioned that weekly paper that I worked for in Franklin. Some former employees of the Chronicle started a weekly paper, actually a daily paper in Franklin, to compete against it. And they finally ended up going weekly, and then they moved it down to North Attleborough, and they started a weekly paper called the News Leader in North Attleborough. That must have been in the early 70s. It didn't last very long. But I think Doug may have looked at that very closely. That a lot of that was going on at the time that he had first come back to the Attleborough Sun and then the Sun Chronicle, and so he may have said, well, there's a market there. You know, I think that I could make that go.
We moved over across the street when the Nifty Nook unfortunately went out of business, Betty Poirier, and we set up shop there. Matter of fact, it was our 10th anniversary now that I think of it. Bill Henschel and myself, who were co-owners of the paper, moved it by ourselves, and we bought a couple pieces of brand spanking new computerized equipment, and we were on our way to the second decade.
Even with their relocation, the Free Press remained in the downtown business district, which was always important to Doug.
We always wanted to be in the center of town because of walk-in traffic. There were a couple suggestions and a couple opportunities that we had to locate other places for cheaper rent, but being downtown is a plus, and people stopped in here daily in some cases. Others came by weekly and continued to suggest that we have a collection box to help the newspaper flourish.
I can think of several stories that ran in the Free Press where people voluntarily came into Doug and said, you know, I've got a story to tell that I think people would be interested in. And Doug said, sit down, I'll be happy to hear it, and would spend hours with people and print their story. And that was very important because certain individuals, like I'm thinking of John Thorpe, who told a whole story about the time when he was at war. He wouldn't tell that story to just anybody, but he trusted Doug, and he felt as though he could give him that whole saga of when he was involved, when he was overseas, and Doug would treat it with respect, which he did. And that kind of goes to show what kind of a person Doug was.
Lisa Arno began working at the Free Press in the early 1990s in advertising sales.
So I think sometimes people got the wrong impression, but that's truly how I would describe him to people. He's the Lou Grant, you know, the rough, brusque, outspoken kind of person, but actually truly didn't reflect his kind-hearted, soft feelings that he actually had. He was actually a warm, fuzzy guy. You didn't always know it from what he said. Truly. Although he didn't have outbursts, because he actually is extremely calm. Truly, but you could see sometimes that was rather controlled.
I found Doug to be really a very interesting boss. He was the first person that I had ever worked for who really was very hands-off. He really gave everyone great freedom and independence. And I think he just kind of expected that everyone would do their job and do it properly. He was obviously very committed to the newspaper. He was there many, many hours a week. I think way more than anyone would have ever expected. It obviously was his baby, and he worked very hard at it. He wanted to produce a good product, and he wanted it to be accepted.
He was very focused on his work. He's always been very focused on his work, and he's the type of person that didn't talk a lot, didn't goof around a lot, didn't spend a lot of time creating anything but the job in front of him at that particular time. I mean, I can remember standing next to him for hours, putting the storyboards together for the paper to be sent down to the printer, and neither one of us would say a word to each other because we would just be focused on the work that we were doing. In front of us, I may have a question, he'd answer the question, and that was it. He was right back doing what he was doing. Generally, that was Monday or Tuesday, depending on when the production schedule fell. And by Wednesday, you know, he was in and out, and you know, back to his old fun-loving self at that point in time. But I think as far as being a teacher and being a mentor, I mean, I think that's probably the best thing I got out of working with him, because he never allowed me to treat myself as though I was the boss's daughter. And I think that that, in the long run, was probably one of the biggest benefits to me personally and professionally as I moved forward.
I mean, I would keep tabs on him, and I presume he was keeping track of what the Sun Chronicle would do. He would mention in his column, he'd always say that that daily paper or the other paper or something like that, where you don't want to mention the name, even mention the name of the competition. And I think we did pretty much the same thing and try to ignore that it existed, you know. And I'm certainly at the time, and I'll give him credit, and Bill Henschel, his partner, credit too, that at the time we started, he said, this will never work, you know.
And Doug's focus never waned through all the years that he published the Free Press. Even through challenging financial times, he would do whatever was needed to keep the paper going.
I think a lot of times people didn't understand how much everyone did, particularly Doug. He was like a one-man news team. You know, he was the photographer, he was the reporter, he was, you know, he covered, you know, the town meetings, he physically put the newspaper together, he, you know, and all of that. And I think truly people sometimes didn't realize how much was done by like one person. He quite literally oftentimes was the one-man news team. And the rest of us were the support, doing the advertising, doing the business part of it. But there were more of us doing that, and there was him doing the news. You know, so there was actually, it was quite a lot. You got a lot done.
Now, for many years, you commuted from Vermont. And
Yes.
you came down.
Yes.
Now, how was that? How was your schedule on that? How did you do
it's
that?
Twice
Every
a week.
week?
Twice a week. I usually did. You know, if there was something major happening on the weekend, I'd stay down, and my daughters are in the area, so I had places to stay. But if they were not around, and there was a little period where neither of them were that close to the community, and so I stayed down in the basement. And
Oh, gee, that's
had
right.
yeah.
Burning the midnight oil there.
Yeah, right. And that way I could get up when I wanted and work it out. But I had a sleeping bag and just threw it on the table, and we were set for the night. But traveling back and forth, I have been doing that now for 11 years. And I usually leave Vermont about 2:30, 3 o'clock in the morning, and get down here for 5:30 in the morning.
And start your day.
Yes, start my
After
day.
that. A lot of time to reflect while you're driving, or?
Oh yes.
Yeah, you kind
You know,
of plan things out a
that's
little
the
bit.
positive. That's
Yeah.
the positive. You can get good ideas and or talk to yourself about some article or plan that you have, and see how lousy it might be or how good it might be. And then if you get a little excited about it, then you're that far away. So, gee, maybe I ought to drive a little faster. You know, that doesn't happen. But I did have a couple accidents going back and forth.
Did you? Yeah.
One time, about 8 years ago this year, I on a patch of ice or snow. It was in late February, as I recall, and snowstorm was coming from Boston side out that way. So I said, it was 2 o'clock in the morning. My wife got called out. She's a visiting nurse.
Oh, yeah.
And I said, I might as well go now and beat the storm. But I didn't. In Orange on Route 2, I hit a section that doesn't have that much salt. You know, that reduced
Reduced
stuff?
salt
Yeah,
area or
yeah,
something it
yeah.
says there on the highway.
Yeah. I didn't pay attention to the sign, and I should have, and spun around 360 a couple times and went off the highway. Fortunately, caught the bottom of the car on guardrail, and it slammed down, and I had a broken disc in my back, and so a little sore now and then.
Yeah.
But and one other occasion, I hit a deer in the rain. But those are the only two.
A lot of driving.
Of any note. Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, I figure as I retire, I'm going to save now with gas prices going up, $75, $100 a week, right?
Quite a lot.
Yeah.
On that. What
Yeah.
are you planning? What are you planning to do during your retirement? Do you have it mapped out? You're gonna
No,
be
I
writing?
don't. You
Just gonna
know,
relax.
a lot of people say that you're not going to be able to retire, and they're probably right. You know, there are a few projects that I want to get done around the house, and I'm sure there are a few things that my wife wants me to get done around the house, but it's nice, quiet country up there, and so it'll be leisure. And if I get bored and really want to get back into newspapers, there are plenty of newspapers in that area that could use a copy editor, a part-time editor, or a copy boy. You know?
Coffee boy. You'll be golfing some, maybe?
Oh, yes.
Yes. Time to spend some time on the green.
Yes.
Yeah, that's good.
I would be very surprised if Doug's not already working for another newspaper in Vermont, you know, because even at his retirement party, he talked about that he was going to take some time off, but you knew that he was going to be looking around for some weekly or daily or some kind of job where you can keep your hand in or write a column or something. And I think everybody in the business wants to do that. I think you want to work forever.
In addition to his newspaper work, Doug always managed to find time to volunteer for public service in his community. We spoke to him about the Hillside Adult Day Health Care Center, of which he was co-founder and its first president.
Obviously, it was a need. It was something that we're all going to be old someday. You're going to be old. I'm already old.
I'm getting
so-
old. I am old.
But no, it was something that the community needed, and we had some good people working on the committee, and did establish one, and it worked. It really worked with volunteers, mainly ourselves. But from the beginning, there were the elderly. They had a place to go for the day, and this helped their families.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, and it has grown amazingly now that you know, it was dropped by us only from necessity, but fortunately it was picked up and has expanded multifold.
It really does seem to fill an important need.
It does, yeah.
Especially, and even in like going to the other side of the age spectrum with the teen center. You were one of the founding folks for the teen center. And how did that all come about? Because there was a lot of discussion getting that going.
There was, yeah. And
where it would be located.
Yeah, yeah. We did have a tough time finding a place for it. Dan Hunt was one of the leading pushers for such a community teen center. He had that as part of his campaign to be selectman. And after he was elected, I did have to prod him a little bit to get back on the track so we could start moving on it. And fortunately, we were able to get a good committee to get that started. And we'd meet weekly and sometimes twice a week. And I had to, or probably I didn't have to, but I did resign from the committee, but still worked with it, because at that time they were talking about conflicts of interest. The town does business with the newspaper, so how can you sit on a town committee?
I remember that.
Yeah.
Careful discussions.
Yeah.
Yeah, a while back.
So that worked out though, and titles meant nothing anyway. So it was the fact that it got done, and it did get done. So we finally started, as you know, and it's still there.
Oh, I know it. It's,
Yeah.
it's really
Again,
nice.
it had to be umbrellaed, but it's something that serves a purpose, really good purpose, you know, for the people who were there.
Doug served on various scout councils and was a coach, umpire, and Little League president. He was a member and on the board of directors for the North Attleborough Plainville Rotary Club and for the United Way of Northern Bristol County. He was an incorporator for the United Way of Greater Attleboro Taunton, and with his interest in the downtown, he was always an active member and officer on the board of directors for the Downtown Associates of North Attleborough. He was honored with 2 preservation awards from the North Attleborough Historical Commission, and his interest in town history always remains strong.
I'll turn it over to you 2 guys.
He was a frequent guest on our local cable programs.
North Attleborough advertiser, and you'll notice that North Attleborough did not have the UGG. I don't know what came first. This was 1902, so maybe Attleborough got the idea seeing the Attleborough advertiser. But there were some great little advertisements in here. A King's Candy Store at the Anawan Block in North Attleborough, the San Souci Shoe Store. I'm sure some of these names are familiar to veterans of the community. And Hall's Line, Hall's 196 Washington Street, North Attleborough. Where was that, Route 1? Did it used to?
Downtown North Attleborough,
Oh, it was,
Washington
okay.
Street, yeah.
Yeah, all right. And as we see, the Chronicle developed over the years. Matter of fact, I think I have an original old copy that I found, give you an idea of what it did look like in, what did I say, 1924. Yeah, it was certainly a broadsheet and
tennis shoes, $1.50.
yeah, I don't think the news that that was carried in the Evening Chronicle changed that much over the years. I mean, the style of writing was virtually the same, and but they did have a lot of page one advertising. We had
You don't see much of that at all anymore.
well,
No.
we do in the Free Press. We try to carry it page one because we make a little bit of money on it,
Oh, yeah?
and that helps to
Oh.
survive.
Says free.
It certainly does, Tom. That's good. Good observation.
We'll move on to question 4, which will be from Doug Reed. And the first person to answer will be Mrs. Poirier.
Mrs. Poirier. With millions from the state coffers going to help keep the Patriots in Foxborough, and likely millions more going to help Boston retain the Red Sox, and with bridges and roads falling apart and elderly health care assistance disappearing, is this fiscally or morally wise for Massachusetts?
Mrs. Poirier.
Thank you. Yes, I do believe it is. The Red Sox are an institution in our state.
In 1998, Doug was asked by the Board of Selectmen to serve on the 20th Century Celebration Committee, which created a number of special events to celebrate the upcoming millennium, one of which was the Millennium Parade. The Free Press was right there with its historical float.
What a beautiful float, represents everything, a very important aspect of our Constitution. Coming up next, you'll see that. There he is.
He's working at his desk.
Yep, the Free Press. That's the editor-in-chief, of course, is Doug Reed. And there's staffers and their families fill the roles of typesetter, photographers, and paper boys. Extra, extra, read all about it in the Free Press.
He's working on a Smith Corona typewriter. We haven't done that for a while.
At the State House, Boston, Massachusetts.
Doug also served as president of the North Attleborough Plainville Chamber of Commerce in 1992, where he earned the Business of the Year Award, and was most recently honored by the Chamber for the 2004 Good Neighbor Award.
I really ought to say thank you. I do appreciate this. It means a lot, and I can recall 18 years ago coming to town. Obviously, I was familiar with North Attleborough, living in Attleborough at the time, and checked with a few people on a suggestion from a friend, Jerry Riley, John Drury, Rick Lako, and a few others, Mike Vigorito, was North Attleborough ready to have its own newspaper again, instead of sharing one with Attleborough. And of course the answer was yes, and we did get started, and 18 years later we're still here, and I've met a heck of a lot of nice people. The first place we came to after we decided to start the newspaper was the Chamber of Commerce, and I'm certainly glad we did. Been a lot of help, and most of you here have been a lot of help too. I appreciate it. Thank you.
With all of his dedication to the community, how did he ever make the decision to leave North Attleborough and sell his newspaper?
I got a call from Carrie Vigorito, and he asked if we were interested in selling the paper, and I said, hadn't really thought about it, and he started telling me his conversation that he had with someone who was looking for an office or a spot location in town for a weekly newspaper. Making that a shorter story, it's I met with the vice president, senior vice president of the company, and he told me what their desires were, and if we were interested, then they would consider it. That was late summer of '03, and it took 3 or 4 months of hard work on their part to look over all our books and records and equipment. Of course, it wasn't that difficult to look over our equipment because it was not in the best of shape, and what the potential was. They had already booked some ideas already because they were interested in the area. They own several newspapers, Pawtucket Times, Woonsocket Call, New Bedford, Fall River, Taunton. So they knew what the area was and what potential it has, and so that wasn't that difficult for them. But it did take some thought. Do we really want to, let this go? But also I have to consider my age, and it's this might not be available in 5-10 years when I really feel that I want to take it easy and sit back. So, but they came up with a decent figure, and knowing what they were going to do, at least at the beginning, I figured, hey, potentially it could be a lot worse, and they did seem to be interested in continuing the aspect of being a community newspaper.
We talked about it a little bit, but not a lot. But this was one of those things that they came looking for him. They came looking for the Free Press. They were looking for, JRC was looking for property apparently in this area. Someone mentioned the Free Press to them, and they came knocking on the door. So it was actually, kind of an unexpected opportunity as, for somebody else to take care of, all the headaches that go with being a small business owner.
Us being a weekly newspaper, now with the Journal Register owning the paper, we send the paper to the pages via telephone to
That's amazing.
Yeah, Connecticut, North Haven, which is north of New Haven, and they have a plant there, and one of the newspapers they own, and it. When we send the pages over at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, they're virtually done by 6 o'clock, printing the paper. And when I come in the morning, 4:30 on Wednesday morning, the papers are there or just about there.
And there they go for another week.
Yeah.
How has journalism changed through the years with new technology and such, or even just the nature of reporters? Are people studying as much, do you think, as they used to? People taking the easy questions, maybe?
I don't know. I think it changed an awful lot with Watergate, as you're aware of, investigative reporting. It was a whole new ballgame as far as people wanting to become involved in newspapers. The tough thing is probably individuals who don't really know how to compose a story because they're going to journalism classes in some cases where the individual who teaches journalism has never been a journalist. It's a book-taught thing. So, I've recommended to any people who have come into the office, what should I do, when I go to college and study journalism, is if you can get involved in a local newspaper, even volunteer your time, do it, because that's where the basics are going to come on. And obviously, as changed so much, technology, from the time when I began. We had linotype machines, you know, and I used to fool around with that in the evenings. It was all hot, molten lead, and you'd have to get these letters out, and every once in a while the machine would squirt a little bit of this hot lead. And I probably still have a few of those.
Wake you up if you're getting tired.
Yes, it would.
Oh, isn't that awful?
Yes, it would.
Yeah.
And every once in a while also there's there's a table which is taller than this and larger than that, but metal. They'd put the mold around the outside of what the page was going to look like, and if it wasn't tight enough and they tried to move it, all of that type may fall all over the floor, and you'd have to start all over again.
What have you seen that has maybe changed in North Attleborough? Maybe what you've liked, what you haven't liked?
I'll tell you one thing that I would have liked, and that was for the town to have a charter. And I know that there obviously are more voters who are against it than were for it, but town really needs an individual who can say realistically the buck stops here, you know, and make decisions. There's no one in town right now. The selectmen are the strongest individual board, but there are so many other boards that they have no control over. You need you know, some people like to say, as the charter study commissions, I think there were 3 since I've been here.
I think there were 3 that I remember,
yeah. But they come out with the proposal of a city as opposed to a town, although a manager or a mayor, whichever, it has to be sometime to really move ahead. Obviously, the mall is the biggest change in town, and that's usurped so much land, not by itself, but with everything that it's generated. Unbelievable the number of homes that have gone up and are going up, and hopefully they're going to prevent some of that, leave some open space, but there isn't that much prime space left in town. I'm happy to see that North Attleborough's downtown has grown over the years and somewhat stabilized, but it's going to be even better, I think, in the next couple of years because of projects that are being planned, and those will work out.
What do you think you're going to miss the most about North Attleborough?
Oh, the people.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, I was walking to the post office every day. You know, sometimes I have to go up there 3 or 4 times because the mail hasn't been sorted yet. I used to have a sign inside that everything in the boxes would be ready by 10 a.m., but I didn't rely on that. It's a good thing because, but you know, walking up in town, you see a lot of people go by that you know, and knew a lot of people in the stores. Mike Vigorito, for instance, you know, stop over and see him all the time, but it was unfortunate that they had to close. But there are other businesses that were downtown, and it just wasn't a downtown business anymore. We've changed. We're more service-oriented now, and that's good. We probably, I think I mentioned before, probably have about 7 or 8 restaurants now, and that's not bad.
Never bad to have a lot of restaurants around.
No, particularly you have choices.
It's always nice to see you walking downtown. We'll miss seeing you walking downtown.
Well, close your eyes and pretend I'm still there.
It is different. Doug was a Free Press, you know, period. End of story. And the Free Press is still going on, and it's going through an evolution, and because it has to, because you know personalities change, and you infuse your personality into your work, and I think everyone does. But you know, we miss Doug.
He became part of the community, and I think that was the most important thing you could have done, you know, to be a part of it, so that they expected to see your face there and missed you when it wasn't. And you were not just sitting in an office someplace. You know, he was really on the street, making the contacts, writing his stuff, writing his weekly column, hiring his kids to write stuff too. You know, and you know that's the way it works.
Sorry, Doug, but he's like an icon, you know. I know he wouldn't like those, you know, letters after his name, Doug Reed, icon, but he truly was. You know, I think although he didn't live in North Attleborough, he lived in Vermont community, but he was very much part of the community, and he actually truly cared about what happened in this town. He cared about the town politics. He cared about what was going on in the school system. He cared about what was going on in this town. And I think people recognize that very much so, because he talked about it, and he talked about it from the heart. Sometimes, you know, don't always agree with what he said, or particularly how he said it. But certainly people knew that he was committed to North Attleborough, and he cared about what happened to this town and to the people that lived here as though it were his own.
So, I mean, my dad has always been my hero, and I always tell him that. Not in so many words, but so for me, you know, just being able to be there and be a part of that, and knowing that he valued, you know, my presence there. I wasn't just a warm body, you know. He wanted me to be there because he appreciated what I had to contribute. Made it a much better job than it could have been, you know, anywhere else, you know, or for anyone else. He was just the type of guy who just didn't care much about what anybody else thought. He just did what he believed in, and that's what drove him. And I think that's what I admire, you know, the most about him, because there are so many people who just care too much about, you know, what other people think, about doing what they can do to get ahead at every cost, and that wasn't him. And you know, and I think those people are few and far between, but I think we were very lucky to have him, and have him in that capacity at the newspaper for so long, because he really did believe in what he did.
In the year 2000, Doug was named a charter member of the New England Press Association's Community Journalism Hall of Fame, a fitting tribute to a person who has dedicated so much of his career building a community newspaper. Doug sold the paper to the Journal-Register Company in 2003, but remained with the paper through his retirement in July of 2005, serving as its editor. While Doug assures us that he'll continue to visit North Attleborough, especially with his children and grandchildren living in the area, we've already begun to miss seeing Doug around town. Doug, we miss you, and we thank you for your perseverance and your vision in bringing the Free Press to our doorsteps each and every week. We wish you the very best in your next adventure.